Sometimes the villain wins.
The wrench slipped from my greasy fingers and clattered against the concrete floor of my garage, echoing like a sharp crack in the sudden silence. I'd been underneath the hood of Mrs. Peterson's ancient Buick when I heard my 17-year-old daughter Ellie's voice cutting through the evening air like a rusty blade. "Dad's such a loser, Mom. I mean, look at him out there, covered in oil, pretending he's some kind of big-shot mechanic when everyone knows his business is going down the drain." I froze, my hand still reaching for the fallen tool. The garage door was open, and through it I could see into our kitchen window where my wife Stephanie stood with her back to me, phone pressed against her ear. Ellie was sprawled across our worn leather couch, painting her nails some god-awful shade of purple. "At least you're finally getting what you deserve," Ellie continued, not bothering to lower her voice. "I know everything, okay? And honestly, good for you." I felt myself go cold inside. 22 years of marriage, and my own daughter was celebrating whatever on earth my wife was up to behind my back. I wiped my hands on my coveralls and stepped closer to the window, staying in the shadows. Stephanie's voice was barely audible, but I caught fragments. "Friday night. Can't keep doing this. He suspects nothing. Friday nights." Her yoga classes that had been running later and later. The new perfume. The way she'd started putting her phone face down on the table during dinner. I'm not stupid. I've been fixing broken things for 30 years. Cars, motorcycles, the occasional marriage counseling session in my garage when the neighbors needed someone to talk to. You learn to spot when something's not running right. But hearing it confirmed by my own kid, that was like taking a sledgehammer to the chest. I slipped back under the hood, my mind racing. Stephanie worked as a paralegal at Morrison & Associates downtown, a fancy law firm that handled real estate deals for the wealthy folks on the other side of town. She'd always been ambitious, always wanted more than what my garage could provide. But I'd thought we were solid. I'd thought 22 years meant something. The Buick's engine suddenly seemed crystal clear to me. Every bolt, every connection, every potential point of failure. Funny how clarity works. Sometimes you need the ground to shift under your feet before you can see what's really broken. I finished up with Mrs. Peterson's car and locked up the garage. Inside the house, Stephanie was bustling around the kitchen, making dinner like nothing had happened. She'd changed into one of her newer outfits, a black dress that hugged her curves in ways that used to make my heart race. Now it just made me suspicious. "How was your day, honey?" she asked without looking up from the stove. "Educational," I said, washing my hands at the kitchen sink. "Learned a lot about engine failure, how the things break down when you don't maintain them properly." She glanced at me with those green eyes that had first caught my attention at a high school football game 25 years ago. "That's nice, dear." Ellie didn't even look up from her phone. The distance between us felt like a canyon. Over the next week, I started paying attention, real attention. The kind I used to pay to engine diagnostics, methodical and thorough. Stephanie's patterns became as clear as a maintenance manual. Tuesday, home at 5:30, like clockwork. Wednesday, home at 6:15, claimed she'd stopped for groceries, no bags. Thursday, home at 5:30 again. Friday, yoga class until 9:45 p.m. On the second Friday, I followed her. She didn't go to the yoga studio on Main Street. Instead, her silver Honda Accord pulled into the parking lot of the Riverside Inn, a mid-level hotel about 20 minutes outside of town. The kind of place that was nice enough for business travelers, but anonymous enough for other activities. I parked across the street behind a dumpster, feeling like a character in one of those detective novels I used to read. At 7:15, a red BMW pulled up. Out stepped a guy I recognized, Brad Morrison, the son of her boss. Tall, lean, probably 10 years younger than me, with the kind of artificially white smile that screamed expensive dental work. He walked into the hotel like he owned the place. 15 minutes later, Stephanie's light came on in a second-floor window. I sat in my truck for 2 hours, watching that window, my hands gripping the steering wheel until my knuckles went white. This was it. This was the moment when everything I'd built, everything I'd believed in, officially turned to ash. But instead of falling apart, something else happened. Something cold and calculating settled into my chest like a perfectly calibrated engine finding its rhythm. If they wanted to play games, I could play games too. I drove home and went straight to my computer. A quick Google search told me everything I needed to know about the Riverside Inn's layout, their room service policies, and their security measures. Another search gave me Brad Morrison's social media profiles, his business information, and his very public relationship status. In a relationship with Jessica Chen. Interesting. Jessica Chen, who worked at the bank downtown and had no idea her boyfriend was spending Friday nights with married women. I spent the weekend planning. Monday morning, I called my old friend Gordon "Gordy" Walsh, who ran a boxing gym on the rough side of town. We'd grown up together, and he was one of the few people who'd never looked down on me for choosing trade work over college. I need a favor, I told him over coffee at his gym, and it involves some creative problem solving. Gordy was built like a fire hydrant with arms like tree trunks and a face that had seen too many fights. But his eyes were sharp, and he'd always been good at reading people. What kind of problem we talking about? He asked. I told him everything. Gordy listened without judgment, occasionally nodding or making small grunting sounds that could have meant anything. So what's the plan? He asked when I finished. I'm going to give them exactly what they deserve, I said, but I'm going to do it smart. No violence, no illegal stuff, just good old-fashioned consequences. Gordy grinned, showing teeth that had been rearranged more than once. Count me in. That Friday, we put phase 1 into motion. While Stephanie was at yoga, Gordy and I paid a visit to the Riverside Inn. I'd called ahead, claiming to be a private investigator working a cheating spouse case. The desk clerk, a college kid who looked bored out of his skull, was surprisingly helpful when I slipped him a $50 bill. Room 237, he said. Same room every Friday for the past 2 months. Gordy kept watch while I installed a tiny wireless camera in the hallway, positioned to capture anyone entering or leaving room 237. Legal, since it was a public hallway, and effective. The next Friday, I was ready. At 9:30 p.m., while Stephanie was still at her yoga class, I sent a text message to every contact in her phone. Thought you might want to see what Stephanie's been up to. Check out this live stream. Then I sent the link to the camera feed. By 9:45, when Stephanie walked through our front door with her yoga mat and her lies, her phone was buzzing like an angry wasp. Everything okay, honey? I asked from my recliner, not looking up from the newspaper. She stared at her phone, her face cycling through confusion, horror, and finally settling on rage. You son of a witch. I folded the newspaper carefully and looked at her. Problem? You know perfectly well what the problem is. Ellie emerged from her room, drawn by the shouting. Her face was pale, and for the first time in months, she wouldn't meet my eyes. So, I said calmly, how was yoga? The next morning, our house felt like a crime scene. Stephanie had locked herself in our bedroom, emerging only to make hushed phone calls that ended the moment I walked into a room. Ellie had gone full teenager in crisis mode, alternating between sobbing dramatically and shooting me accusatory looks like this was somehow my fault. My phone had been ringing nonstop since 6 a.m. Half the calls were from friends and neighbors who'd seen the video. Some offering support, others just fishing for gossip. The other half were from Stephanie's family, and those calls I let go to voicemail. I was in the garage, trying to lose myself in the familiar rhythm of brake pad replacement, when Gordy showed up with coffee and donuts. So, he said, settling onto a milk crate that served as my unofficial guest chair, how's domestic life treating you this morning? Like an engine fire in a gas station, I said, not looking up from the brake caliper. Explosive and probably going to get worse before it gets better. Stephanie talked to you yet? Does screaming count as talking? Gordy chuckled. What about the kid? I sighed and straightened up, wiping my hands on a rag. Ellie's 17. In her world, I'm the villain who destroyed her perfect family by exposing her mother's affair. Logic doesn't really factor into it. Give her time. Kids are smarter than we give them credit for. Before I could respond, a red BMW pulled into my driveway. Brad Morrison climbed out, looking like he'd stepped off the cover of some men's fashion magazine. Expensive suit, perfect hair, the kind of confidence that comes from never having to worry about money. Well, Gordy said, standing up and cracking his knuckles, this should be interesting. Brad walked into my garage like he owned it, which immediately set my teeth on edge. This was my space, my sanctuary, and he had no right to be here. We need to talk, he said, his voice carrying that particular tone rich people use when they're trying to sound reasonable while making demands. Do we? I asked, turning back to the brake job. Because from where I'm standing, we said everything that needed saying last night, in high definition. Look, I know you're upset. Upset, I laughed, but there was no humor in it. Brad, I'm not upset. Upset is when someone cuts you off in traffic or your favorite restaurant runs out of pie. What I am is enlightened. He stepped closer, and I could smell his expensive cologne mixed with what might have been fear sweat. This doesn't have to get ugly. Stephanie and we didn't plan for this to happen. I set down my wrench and turned to face him fully. Gordy moved to my left, not threatening exactly, but making his presence known. You didn't plan to get caught, I corrected. There's a difference. I'm trying to be reasonable here. Reasonable. I tasted the word like it was something rotten. You've been screwing my wife for 2 months, turning my daughter against me, and making me look like a fool in my own town. But you want to be reasonable. Brad's perfectly composed facade cracked just a little. Stephanie's not happy, Jack. She hasn't been for years. We're in love. The words hit me like a punch to the gut, but I kept my expression neutral. In love, right? Is Jessica Chen aware of this great love story? His face went pale. Jessica has nothing to do with this. Doesn't she? Because, from what I can see, you're quite the romantic. 2 girlfriends, both of them thinking they're special. That's either impressive or pathetic, and I'm leaning toward pathetic. Gordy snorted. I vote pathetic. Brad's composure finally snapped. You don't understand. Stephanie deserves better than this. He gestured around my garage with obvious disgust. She's educated, sophisticated. She shouldn't be stuck married to some grease monkey who can barely keep his own business afloat. The insult hung in the air like exhaust fumes. I felt Gordy tense beside me, ready to turn Brad's perfect face into abstract art. But I held up a hand. You know what, Brad? You're absolutely right. Stephanie does deserve better. She deserves a husband who's faithful. She deserves a man who doesn't lie to her face every day. She deserves someone who respects her enough not to make her the other woman. I picked up a heavy wrench and hefted it casually, not threatening, just examining it like I was considering its weight and balance. But, most of all, she deserves someone who doesn't come into her husband's garage and insult him in his own space. Brad took a step back. Are you threatening me? Me? Threaten you? I laughed. Brad, I fix things for a living. I solve problems, and right now, you're a problem that needs solving. Before he could respond, Stephanie appeared in the garage doorway. She'd finally emerged from the bedroom, dressed in one of her power suits like she was heading to court instead of dealing with the wreckage of her marriage. Brad, what are you doing here? She demanded, trying to talk some sense into your husband. My husband, she said, her voice dripping with disdain, has apparently lost his mind, humiliating me in front of the entire town, destroying my reputation. Your reputation? I interrupted. Stephanie, you destroyed your own reputation. I just provided the documentation. She turned on me, with fury blazing in her green eyes. You had no right! What happens between us should stay between us. Like your Friday night yoga classes? That's different. How is it different? She opened and closed her mouth like a fish gasping for air. Finally, she settled on, you're controlling and manipulative. You always have been. I felt something cold and sharp settle in my chest. Controlling. For 22 years, I've supported your career, your dreams, your ambitions. I've worked 60-hour weeks to pay for Ellie's private school and your law courses and this house and everything else you wanted. But I'm controlling. You never wanted me to succeed. I wanted you to succeed without destroying our family in the process. Brad stepped forward, putting a protective arm around Stephanie's shoulders. The gesture was so perfectly calculated, so obviously designed to provoke me, that I almost admired its effectiveness. Stephanie doesn't have to justify herself to you anymore, he said. We're together now. Deal with it. I looked at them standing there, united against me, and felt the last piece of my old life crumble away. But instead of grief, I felt something else. Something cold and focused and dangerous. You know what? I said, setting down the wrench with deliberate care. You're right. Stephanie doesn't have to justify anything to me anymore. Because as of Monday morning, she won't be my problem. I walked to my workbench and pulled out a manila envelope I'd prepared that morning. Inside were divorce papers I'd had drawn up by a lawyer in the next town over, someone who didn't know Stephanie or her boss. Congratulations, I said, handing the envelope to Stephanie. You're free? She stared at the papers like they were written in a foreign language. You can't be serious. Dead serious. You want Brad? You can have him. You want out of this marriage? Consider yourself out. But the house, my thing, will be handled according to state law. 50-50 split of marital assets, assuming there are any left after we account for the money you and Brad have been siphoning into that private account. The color drained from both their faces. That's right, I continued. I know about the account. I know about the credit cards you opened in my name. I know about the loan you took out against the house without my signature. Did you really think I wouldn't notice? Stephanie's voice came out as a whisper. How did you? I'm not stupid, Stephanie. Uneducated, maybe. Blue collar, definitely. But not stupid. I turned to Brad. And you, Romeo. I hope you're ready to support a wife in the style she's accustomed to, because the gravy train just derailed. Brad's perfect composure finally shattered completely. You can't prove anything, can't I? Bank records are funny things. They leave trails. So do forged signatures. So do unauthorized loans. I wasn't bluffing, and they both knew it. I'd spent the weekend going through every financial record I could find, and the picture that emerged was uglier than I'd imagined. They hadn't just been having an affair, they'd been systematically looting our joint accounts to fund their little love nest. This isn't over, Stephanie said, but her voice lacked conviction. No, I agreed. It's not, but the next phase is going to be a lot more interesting. They left together, Brad's arm still around Stephanie's shoulders, but the gesture looked less protective now and more like mutual support for the walking wounded. Gordy waited until their car disappeared down the street before he started laughing. Jesus, Jack, you really know how to twist the knife. That wasn't twisting the knife, I said, turning back to the brake job. That was just the opening move. The divorce papers hit Stephanie like a slap of cold water, but her recovery time was impressive. By Wednesday, she'd moved out of our house and into Brad's downtown apartment. By Thursday, she'd hired a lawyer, not just any lawyer, but Tina Rodriguez from the most aggressive family law firm in the state. I knew Tina from way back. We'd been business partners briefly in my 20s before I'd bought her out of the garage and gone solo. It hadn't ended well. She'd accused me of cheating her out of her fair share, and I'd accused her of trying to run the business into the ground with her reckless spending. 20 years later, she was a successful attorney with a reputation for taking no prisoners in divorce cases. Hiring Tina wasn't just about getting good legal representation, it was a declaration of war, fine by me. I'd been playing defense for too long. Friday afternoon, Tina showed up at my garage with papers of her own. She'd filled out nicely over the years. Expensive suit, perfect makeup, the kind of predatory confidence that comes from years of destroying people in court. Hello, Jack, she said, her voice honey-sweet with just enough acid underneath to etch glass. Long time no see. I didn't look up from the carburetor I was rebuilding. Tina, I figured you'd show up eventually. Your wife has retained my services. Ex-wife, or soon-to-be ex-wife. About that. She set a thick folder on my workbench. I'm afraid things aren't going to be quite as simple as you seem to think. I wiped my hands and opened the folder. Inside were financial documents, property assessments, and a preliminary settlement offer that would have been hilarious if it wasn't so insulting. Let me see if I understand this, I said, scanning the papers. Stephanie gets the house, half my business, alimony, and I get to keep my tools and my truck. That about right? Your wife sacrificed her career to support your business. My wife worked full-time as a paralegal while I built this business from nothing. She provided emotional support, managed the household. She hired a cleaning service and ordered takeout 4 nights a week. Tina's smile never wavered, but her eyes went cold. Jack, I'm trying to be reasonable here. My client is willing to settle this amicably. But if you want to fight... She let the threat hang in the air like smoke from a bad exhaust pipe. Actually, I said, closing the folder and handing it back to her, I think fighting sounds like fun. It's been a while since I had a good challenge. You have no idea what you're up against. Don't I? I leaned against my workbench, studying her face. Tina, you always did underestimate me. It's what cost you your share of this garage, and it's what's going to cost you this case. Her professional mask slipped just enough to show the anger underneath. You screwed me over once, Jack. I won't let it happen again. I didn't screw you over. I saved this business from your incompetence. There's a difference. She gathered up her papers with sharp, angry movements. We'll see who's incompetent when this is over. After she left, I sat in my garage for a long time thinking. Tina was good at her job, and she had resources I didn't. But she also had weaknesses. and I'd had 20 years to think about what they were. I called Gordy and asked him to meet me at Murphy's Tavern, a dive bar on the edge of town where the beer was cheap and the conversations were private. "So," Gordy said, settling into a booth with a pitcher of beer between us, "how bad is it?" I told him about Tina's offer and her threats. Gordy listened, occasionally shaking his head or muttering curses under his breath. "What do you need?" he asked when I finished. "Information, leverage, the kind of stuff that doesn't show up in court documents." Gordy grinned. "I know a guy who knows a guy." "What kind of guy?" "The kind who used to work for the state attorney's office before he got tired of the politics. Now he does private investigation work. Very private, very thorough." I thought about it. Going after Tina and Brad and Stephanie this way would be expensive, and there was no guarantee it would work. But playing by their rules in their system was a guaranteed loss. "Set up a meeting," I said. 3 days later, I was sitting in a coffee shop across town with a thin, nervous-looking man named Pete Kowalski, who claimed to have information that could change the trajectory of my situation. "Your wife's boyfriend," Pete said, sliding a manila envelope across the table, "has some interesting financial arrangements." I opened the envelope and found bank statements, credit reports, and what looked like surveillance photos of Brad meeting with various people in expensive suits. "Brad Morrison isn't just a real estate broker," Pete continued. "He's been laundering money for some very wealthy clients who prefer to keep their transactions off the official books. Nothing technically illegal, but the kind of thing that would make the IRS very interested in his business practices." I studied the documents. "How did you get this?" "Let's just say Mr. Morrison isn't as careful with his digital security as he should be." The photos showed Brad meeting with men I recognized as local business owners, the kind who owned cash-heavy businesses like restaurants and construction companies, the kind who might need help moving money around without attracting attention. "What about Tina?" "Tina?" I asked. Pete's smile was thin and sharp. "Ms. Rodriguez has her own vulnerabilities, bar complaints, client trust account irregularities, a gambling problem she thinks nobody knows about." He slid another envelope across the table. This one contained casino receipts, loan documents, and what appeared to be disciplinary records from the State Bar Association. "She's been borrowing from client trust accounts to cover her losses," Pete explained. "Always pays it back before anyone notices, but it's still a felony." I felt something cold and predatory settle in my chest. How much for all of this? $5,000, cash. It was most of my emergency fund, but looking at the evidence spread across the table, it felt like the best investment I'd ever made. Deal. That night, I sat in my empty house. Ellie was staying with friends, claiming she couldn't stand to be around me, and planned my counterattack. Stephanie and Brad and Tina thought they were playing chess while I was playing checkers. Time to show them how wrong they were. I started with Brad. Monday morning, I made copies of Pete's financial documents and mailed them anonymously to the State Real Estate Commission, the IRS, and Brad's biggest client. I also sent copies to Jessica Chen, along with a note, "Thought you should know what your boyfriend does in his spare time." Tuesday, I leaked Tina's gambling problem to the State Bar Association's ethics hotline. I didn't mention the trust account irregularities, and that was my ace in the hole. Wednesday, I got creative. I knew from Pete's surveillance that Brad and Stephanie had been meeting at a different hotel every week, trying to avoid detection after the Riverside Inn incident. This week, they were at the Marriott downtown. I called the hotel's front desk, claiming to be Brad's business partner with an urgent delivery. The desk clerk was happy to give me the room number, and at 8 p.m., while they were presumably enjoying their romantic evening, I had a dozen roses delivered to their room. The card read, "From your biggest fan, Jay." At 8:15, I had a bottle of champagne delivered. The card, "Congratulations on your performance." Jay, at 8:30, I had room service deliver a cake. The card, "Hope you're having as much fun as I am." She. At 8:45, I called the hotel's front desk and reported a noise complaint about loud music coming from their room. At 9 o'clock, I called back and reported suspicious activity. People coming and going at all hours. By 9:30, hotel security was knocking on their door, and I was sitting in my truck across the street watching Brad and Stephanie emerge from the hotel lobby looking harassed and humiliated. It wasn't much, but it was a start. Thursday morning, Tina called me. "What the heck do you think you're doing?" she demanded. "I'm not sure what you mean. The flowers, the champagne, the harassment, I sent flowers to celebrate their love. Is that illegal now? You're playing a dangerous game, Jack. Am I? Because from where I'm sitting, I'm just a heartbroken husband trying to process his emotions through gift giving. There was a long pause. When Tina spoke again, her voice was deadly quiet. You want to play hardball? Fine, but remember, I know all your secrets too. She hung up, but I wasn't worried. I'd been preparing for this conversation for 20 years. Friday afternoon, Stephanie showed up at the garage. She looked tired, stressed, and older than her 38 years. We need to talk, she said. Do we? This has to stop. The harassment, the games, the consequences? She flinched. I know you're hurt. I know you're angry, but this isn't solving anything. I set down my tools and really looked at her for the first time in weeks. The woman I'd fallen in love with was still there, buried under layers of ambition and disappointment and bad choices. You're right, I said. This isn't solving anything, but it's sure as heck making me feel better. Jack, please, can't we handle this like adults? Adults don't have affairs, Stephanie. Adults don't steal money from their spouses. Adults don't turn their children against their fathers. She had the grace to look ashamed, at least for a moment. I never meant for it to go this far, but it did. And now we're here. So what happens now? I smiled, and I could see my expression reflected in her eyes, cold, calculating, and completely without mercy. Now, man, I said, things get interesting. The interesting part started Saturday morning when Brad's BMW wouldn't start. He called a tow truck, and the mechanic found sugar in the gas tank. An old myth, actually. Sugar doesn't really damage engines, but it does require an expensive tank cleaning and fuel system flush. I know this because I'm the mechanic he called. Jack, Brad's voice on the phone was tight with barely controlled rage. Did you do this? Do what? You know perfectly well what. Brad, I'm hurt. Are you accusing me of vandalism? Because that would be a serious accusation to make without proof. I know it was you. Prove it. He couldn't, of course. I'd been careful. Security cameras don't cover the entire parking lot of Brad's apartment complex. And I'd worn a baseball cap and kept my head down during my 3 a.m. visit. This is harassment, he said. This is business. You want your car fixed or not? He hung up on me, which was fine. I hadn't really expected him to bring his BMW to the garage anyway. What I had expected was for him to call the police. Officer Mike Duffy showed up at my garage around noon, looking like a man who'd rather be anywhere else. Mike and I had gone to high school together, and he'd brought his patrol car to me for off-the-books maintenance for years. Jack, he said, settling his bulk against my workbench, we need to talk. About what? About Brad Morrison's car, about hotel deliveries, about harassment complaints. I kept working on the engine in front of me, a '98 Ford pickup that had seen better decades. Sounds like Brad's having a rough week. Jack, I looked up at him. Mike's face was serious but not unfriendly. Am I under arrest? Not yet, but you're walking a fine line here. What line would that be? The line between being a jilted husband and being a stalker. I set down my wrench and gave Mike my full attention. Mike, let me ask you something. If your wife was cheating on you and her boyfriend was stealing your money and they were trying to take everything you'd worked for your whole life, what would you do? Mike was quiet for a long moment. I'd be pissed. Pissed enough to send some flowers? Maybe. Pissed enough to make their lives a little inconvenient? Probably. But not pissed enough to do anything actually illegal, Mike sighed. Jack, I can't prove you did anything to Brad's car. Heck, I can't prove you sent those flowers. But I'm telling you as a friend, be careful. These people have lawyers and money and connections. You keep poking them, they're going to poke back harder. Let them poke. After Mike left, I called Pete Kowalski. I need more information, I told him, about all of them. Schedules, habits, weaknesses, everything. That's going to cost extra. How much extra? Another $3,000. I thought about my dwindling savings account. Do it. Pete's second report arrived Monday morning, and it was worth every penny. Detailed surveillance logs, financial records, even social media analysis. I learned that Tina had a standing poker game every Tuesday night at an underground casino in the warehouse district. I learned that Brad had been lying to Jessica Chen about more than just his affair with Stephanie. He'd also been using her employee access at the bank to get information about potential real estate clients. Most importantly, I learned that Stephanie had been lying to me about more than just the affair. According to Pete's financial investigation, Stephanie hadn't just been siphoning money from our joint accounts. She'd also taken out a second mortgage on our house, forging my signature on the documents, and used the money to invest in one of Brad's real estate deals. A real estate deal that had gone bad, losing every penny of the investment. My house, our house, the place where I'd raised my daughter and built my life, was leveraged to the hilt for a failed get-rich-quick scheme I'd never even known about. I sat in my garage, staring at the documents, feeling something cold and final settle in my chest. This wasn't just about an affair anymore. This was about the systematic destruction of everything I'd built. Time to stop playing defense. Tuesday night, I followed Tina to her poker game. The warehouse district was exactly what you'd expect. Abandoned buildings, broken streetlights, and the kind of atmosphere that made honest people nervous. The game was in the back room of what used to be a furniture store, now serving as a front for various activities that preferred to avoid official scrutiny. I didn't go inside. Instead, I waited in my truck until the game broke up around 2 a.m., then followed Tina to her car. She was drunk. Not falling down drunk, but definitely over the legal limit. I called in an anonymous tip to the police about a suspected drunk driver, providing Tina's license plate number and location. She was pulled over 6 blocks from the warehouse and arrested for DUI. A DUI arrest wouldn't end Tina's career, but it would cause problems. Bar associations frown on criminal charges, even minor ones. It would also be expensive, embarrassing, and time-consuming. Most importantly, it would distract her from my divorce case. Wednesday morning, I got a call from Stephanie. Tina was arrested last night, she said without preamble. Was she? That's unfortunate. You did this. I did what? Stephanie, are you accusing me of forcing your lawyer to drive drunk? You know what I mean. Actually, I don't. But if Tina has a drinking problem, maybe you should consider finding new representation. Stephanie was quiet for a moment. When she spoke again, her voice was different, less angry, more calculating. What do you want, Jack? I want what's mine. The house, the business. I'll fight you for every penny. Will you? Even when the court finds out about the forged mortgage documents? Another long silence. I don't know what you're talking about. Sure you do. $50,000 borrowed against the house without my knowledge or consent. Used to invest in Brad's Riverside development project, which went bankrupt 3 months ago. I could hear her breathing on the other end of the line. That's forgery, Stephanie. It's also fraud. The kind of charges that could send you to prison. You can't prove anything, can't I? Handwriting analysis is pretty sophisticated these days. So is financial forensics. Want to bet your freedom on how good your forgery skills are? She hung up on me, but I wasn't worried. The seed was planted. Thursday, I escalated. I knew from Pete's surveillance that Brad met with clients every Thursday afternoon at a coffee shop downtown, trying to rebuild his business after the Riverside development disaster. I also knew that Jessica Chen still didn't know about his relationship with Stephanie. Brad had somehow convinced her that the hotel incident was a misunderstanding. So I decided to clear up the misunderstanding. I arrived at the coffee shop early and took a table with a clear view of Brad's usual spot. When he arrived with his client, a nervous-looking man in an expensive suit who was probably considering investing in Brad's next scheme, I was ready. I waited until they were deep in conversation, then walked over to their table. "Brad," I said loudly enough for half the coffee shop to hear. "Good to see you, buddy." Brad's face went pale. "Jack, what are you doing here?" "Just grabbing coffee." "Hey, how's Stephanie? You two still meeting at hotels every Friday? Or have you found somewhere more permanent?" The client looked confused and uncomfortable. Brad looked like he wanted to crawl under the table. "Jack, this isn't the time." "Oh, sorry, am I interrupting a business meeting?" I turned to the client. "I'm Jack Morrison, by the way. Brad's been sleeping with my wife. Well, my ex-wife now, thanks to Brad." The client stood up abruptly. "I think I should go." "Wait," Brad said desperately. But the man was already heading for the door. I sat down in the vacated chair. "So how's business?" "You son of a witch. Now, that's no way to talk to your girlfriend's ex-husband." Brad leaned forward, his voice low and dangerous. "You're going to regret this." "Am I?" "Because from where I'm sitting, I'm having the time of my life." I stood up and patted him on the shoulder. "Give my regards to Stephanie and to Jessica when you finally work up the courage to tell her the truth." Friday afternoon, the other shoe dropped. Jessica Chen showed up at my garage, looking like a woman who'd recently had her world turned upside down. She was small, pretty, and absolutely furious. "You or Jack Morrison," she said. It wasn't a question. I am. We need to talk. I gestured to a pair of folding chairs I kept for customers. Have a seat. She sat down carefully, like she was afraid she might break something. Brad told me about you, about your wife. What did he tell you? That you're crazy, that you've been stalking them, that you can't accept that your marriage is over. I nodded thoughtfully. And what do you think? I think he's been lying to me for months. I think he's been using me to get information about bank customers. I think he's a cheating, manipulative bastard who doesn't deserve either one of us. That's a pretty accurate assessment. She was quiet for a moment, staring at her hands. How long have you known? About the affair, a few weeks. About Brad using you for bank information? I just found out this week. God, I'm such an idiot. No, you're not. You're a woman who trusted someone who didn't deserve it. That doesn't make you an idiot. It makes you human. She looked up at me, and I could see tears threatening at the corners of her eyes. What are you going to do now? I thought about it. I'm going to finish what they started. Can I help? I studied her face. The anger, the hurt, the desire for revenge that I recognized, because I felt it myself. Actually, I said, I think you can. The community center's annual fall festival was Milltown's biggest social event, where half the town showed up to eat bad barbecue, listen to worse music, and catch up on 6 months' worth of gossip. This year, it was also going to be the stage for the final act of my personal drama. Jessica Chen had proven to be an invaluable ally. Her access to Brad's banking information, legitimate access since they'd been dating for over a year, had revealed the full scope of his financial manipulations. Not just the money laundering I'd already discovered, but a complex web of fraudulent loans, phantom investments, and outright theft that made my wife's affair look like a minor side note. More importantly, Jessica had something I didn't: legal standing to file complaints with the Banking Commission, the Real Estate Board, and the District Attorney's Office. By the time the Fall Festival rolled around on the last Saturday in October, Brad Morrison was facing investigations from 3 different state agencies and a potential federal inquiry into his money laundering activities. Tina Rodriguez, meanwhile, was dealing with her DUI case, a formal complaint to the state bar about her gambling debts, and the discovery that several of her former clients were requesting audits of their case settlements. Her law practice was hemorrhaging clients and money. And Stephanie? Stephanie was about to discover what it felt like to be completely alone. I arrived at the Fall Festival early, helping to set up tables and chairs like I had every year for the past decade. The difference was that this year, people kept stopping to talk to me. Word had gotten around about the divorce, the affair, and my various acts of creative revenge. Opinion was split. Some people thought I was a hero, others thought I'd gone too far. But everyone had an opinion, and everyone wanted to share it. "Jack," called out Mrs. Henderson from the Methodist Church. "How are you holding up, honey?" "Better every day, Mrs. Henderson. That wife of yours always did think she was too good for this town." Before I could respond, she was bustling away to share her opinions with someone else. I finished setting up my assigned table and went to find Gordy, who was manning the beer tent with his usual enthusiasm. "You ready for this?" "Yeah," he asked, handing me a plastic cup of lukewarm beer. "As ready as I'll ever be. What if they don't show?" I smiled. "Oh, they'll show. Tina's too proud to hide. Brad's too stupid to stay away, and Stephanie needs to make a public appearance to salvage what's left of her reputation." As if summoned by my words, I spotted Stephanie's silver Honda pulling into the parking lot. She emerged wearing a conservative blue dress and a determined expression, clearly ready to face down the gossips and reclaim her position in Milltown society. Brad's red BMW was right behind her, which surprised me. I'd expected him to stay away, given his legal troubles. But there he was, climbing out of his car like he owned the place, still playing the role of successful businessman despite everything that had happened. The real surprise was the third car in their little convoy, a black Mercedes that I recognized as Tina's. She stepped out wearing a power suit and dark sunglasses, looking like she was ready for battle. "The gang's all here," Gordy observed. "Indeed they are." I watched as the 3 of them conferred near the parking lot, clearly planning their strategy for the afternoon. Whatever they had in mind, it was going to be interesting. The first hour of the festival passed normally. I worked at the garage's information booth, talking to potential customers and trying to act like everything was perfectly normal. Stephanie, Brad, and Tina circulated separately, each trying to control the narrative in their own way. Stephanie focused on the church ladies, playing the role of wronged woman who was trying to rebuild her life after a harmful and controlling marriage. Brad worked the business owners, insisting that his legal troubles were just a misunderstanding that would be cleared up soon. Tina held court with the other professionals, positioning herself as the voice of reason, trying to help her clients through a difficult situation. It was a masterful performance, and if I hadn't known the truth, I might have been impressed. Around 2 p.m., the festival's main event began, a series of speeches from local business leaders and politicians, followed by the presentation of community awards. I'd been asked to say a few words about the importance of supporting local businesses, a request I'd accepted with particular enthusiasm. When my turn came, I walked to the makeshift podium that had been set up on the community center's small stage. The crowd, maybe 200 people, settled down to listen. "Thank you all for coming out today," I began, my voice carrying clearly across the crowd, thanks to the borrowed PA system. "It's great to see so many familiar faces." I spotted Stephanie near the front, her expression carefully neutral. Brad was off to the side, looking uncomfortable. Tina stood near the back, her arms crossed and her face unreadable behind her sunglasses. "I've been part of this community for over 20 years, I continued. "I've fixed your cars, helped your kids with their science projects, and tried to be the kind of neighbor you could count on. In return, you've supported my business and welcomed me into your lives." Murmurs of agreement from the crowd. So far, so good. But recently, I've learned some hard lessons about trust, about loyalty, about what happens when people you care about decide that their own interests are more important than the relationships they've built. The crowd was getting quieter, sensing that this wasn't going to be a typical Chamber of Commerce speech. 3 months ago, I discovered that my wife of 22 years was having an affair. Not just any affair, but one with a man who was systematically stealing money from our joint accounts to fund his failing business ventures. A ripple of shock went through the crowd. This was the first time I'd spoken publicly about the details of my situation. I also discovered that this same man had been using his girlfriend, another victim of his lies, to gain illegal access to banking information for his real estate schemes. I could see Brad starting to move toward the stage, but Gordy and a couple of his friends from the boxing gym had positioned themselves to block his path. But the real betrayal wasn't the affair. It wasn't even the theft. It was the discovery that my own lawyer, a woman I'd once considered a friend and business partner, was orchestrating the whole thing as part of a 20-year grudge over a business deal that went bad. Now Tina was moving, pushing through the crowd toward the stage. But she was too far away, and I wasn't done yet. You see, some people in this town think that success means just stepping on others. They think that education makes them better than the people who work with their hands. They think that money and status give them the right to lie, cheat, and steal from their neighbors. The crowd was completely silent now, hanging on every word. Well, I'm here to tell you that they're wrong. Success isn't about how much money you have or how many degrees hang on your wall. It's about integrity. It's about keeping your word, and it's about treating people with respect, even when they can't do anything for you. I paused, letting my own eyes sweep across the crowd until they found Stephanie's face. My wife chose to throw away 22 years of marriage for a man who's now facing federal charges for money laundering. My former business partner chose to risk her law license to settle a score that should have been forgotten decades ago. And both of them chose to drag innocent people, including my daughter, into their web of lies and manipulation. Tina had finally reached the edge of the stage area, but the crowd was packed too tightly for her to get any closer. "But here's the thing about consequences," I said, my voice rising slightly. "They don't care about your education or your status or your connections. They don't care if you think you're too smart to get caught or too important to face justice. Consequences are like gravity. They apply to everyone equally." I reached into my jacket pocket and pulled out a thick manila envelope, which is why I'm donating copies of all the evidence I've gathered about fraud, forgery, money laundering, and professional misconduct to the appropriate authorities. Bank records, forged documents, surveillance photos, recorded phone calls, everything. The crowd erupted in shocked murmurs and excited chatter. I could see Stephanie's face had gone completely white, and Brad looked like he was about to be sick. "Because that's what good neighbors do," I continued, raising my voice to be heard over the noise. They look out for each other. They protect each other from people who would take advantage of their trust. I held up the envelope for everyone to see. This contains evidence of crimes that have been committed against not just me, but against this entire community. Money stolen from local banks, fraudulent real estate deals that cost investors their savings, legal malpractice that put clients at risk. Tina was shouting something, but I couldn't hear her over the crowd noise. So I want everyone here to know that justice isn't just for the rich and connected. It's for all of us. And sometimes when the system fails, we have to make our own justice. I walked to the edge of the stage and handed the envelope to Officer Mike Duffy, who had been standing near the front of the crowd looking increasingly uncomfortable. Mike, I believe this belongs to you. The crowd erupted in applause and chaos. People were shouting questions, pushing forward to get a better look, and generally behaving like they were witnessing the most exciting thing to happen in Milltown in years. Which, to be fair, they probably were. I stepped back to the microphone for one final comment. Oh, and one more thing, I said, waiting for the crowd to quiet down slightly. Brad, Stephanie, Tina, if any of you are thinking about leaving town before the authorities have a chance to investigate these allegations, you should know that I've also provided copies of all this evidence to the FBI's white-collar crime unit. The look of absolute panic on their faces was worth every penny I'd spent on Pete Kowalski's investigation. Thank you all for your attention, I concluded. And remember, support your local businesses, especially the honest ones. I walked off the stage to thunderous applause, leaving behind the most spectacular public meltdown in Milltown history. Brad was the first to break. He pushed through the crowd toward the parking lot, probably planning to get in his BMW and drive until he ran out of gas. But when he reached his car, he found all 4 tires had been slashed and fraud had been spray-painted across his windshield. He spun around, looking for me in the crowd, his face twisted with rage. "You son of a witch! You did this!" I was standing about 20 feet away, surrounded by well-wishers and curious townspeople. Did what, Brad? I've been on stage for the last 15 minutes. The tires, the paint. I looked around at the crowd, all of whom had been watching me give my speech. Does anyone here think I had time to vandalize Brad's car? A chorus of no and impossible rose from the crowd. Brad realized how stupid he sounded and how trapped he was. "This isn't over," he snarled. "Actually," said a new voice, "I think it is." We all turned to see 2 men in dark suits walking toward us from the parking lot. They had the unmistakable look of federal agents, serious, professional, and completely unimpressed by small-town drama. "Bradford Morrison," one of them said, pulling out a badge. "FBI, we'd like to ask you some questions about your business activities." Brad's face went from red to white to green in the space of about 3 seconds. "I want a lawyer." "That's your right, but we're going to need you to come with us." As they led Brad away in handcuffs, I caught sight of Stephanie standing near the community center entrance, looking lost and alone. For a moment, I almost felt sorry for her. Then I remembered the forged mortgage documents and the feeling passed. Tina, meanwhile, had disappeared entirely. Smart move on her part. She probably had about 24 hours before her own legal troubles caught up with her. The crowd was starting to disperse, people heading home with enough gossip to last them until Christmas. Gordy appeared at my elbow with a fresh beer and a huge grin. "Jesus, Jack, that was beautiful." It was necessary. So what happens now? I looked around at the festival grounds, at the community I'd called home for over 20 years, at the people who'd supported me through the worst period of my life. Now, I said, I get back to work. But first, there was one more thing I needed to do. I walked over to where Stephanie was standing, still looking shell-shocked by everything that had happened. "Stephanie," she looked up at me with eyes that were red from crying. "Jack, don't," I said quietly. "Don't apologize. Don't make excuses. Don't try to explain. It's too late for all of that." She nodded, apparently understanding that there was nothing left to say. "The house is yours," I continued. "I'm moving into the apartment above the garage, but the mortgage you forged, that's your problem now. And the legal bills from all of this, also your problem." "What about Ellie?" "Ellie's 17. She can make her own choices about where she wants to live and who she wants to have a relationship with." Stephanie's face crumpled. "I never meant for any of this to happen." "I know," I said, "but it did happen, and now we all have to live with the consequences." I turned and walked away, leaving her standing alone in the middle of the festival grounds. As I headed back to my truck, I felt something I hadn't experienced in months. Peace. Not happiness exactly, but a sense that justice had been served and balance had been restored. The villain had won, but sometimes the villain is the only one willing to do what needs to be done. I drove home to my empty garage, cracked open a beer, and smiled. Funny thing about being the villain, sometimes it's the only way to win.